Welcome back into the GSMC Sports Podcast, and we're now going to be moving on to talking about the state of Brandon Ingram and where he stands in the NBA right now, as he has been probably a name that has been thrown out to just about every team in terms of kicking the tires on whether or not he would be worth going after, and the Pelicans have gotten pretty much no response in return because of that. And it's in large part because of the fact that Ingram is on an expiring contract. He's headed into the final year of his current contract, and he has openly said that he is expecting big money from the Pelicans. He was hoping to receive a 4-year, $208 million max extension this offseason, and the Pelicans weren't willing to give him that. So they've been shopping him around, and we are seeing sort of the avenues of trade partners sort of closing. Now, the Sacramento Kings were a team that were reportedly in the mix for a bit there, but they instead decided to acquire DeMar DeRozan over this past weekend. The Atlanta Hawks were one of the top teams that were once thought of as a trade destination for Brandon Ingram, but an interesting report did come out within the past 48 hours or so that the Pelicans were trying to include Brandon Ingram in that deal when they made the trade for DeJounte Murray, but the Hawks were the ones that would not go for it. And it was because of two reasons: that Atlanta did not want to have to worry about giving him a big contract, and that they did not want to include Clint Capella in the deal. So, a couple things on this here. I think that Brandon Ingram could have been a potential, really good fit for Atlanta, but I also understand their reservations about it, because as we saw from the deal that they made, they sort of prioritized getting a younger player in Dyson Daniels, getting some future draft picks, and getting a big in Larry Nance Jr. that should look to be a pretty good pick and roll partner with Trae Young. And it seems like, at least to me, the Hawks are hoping to take a step back a little bit in terms of this idea of being instant contenders. I feel like their front office sort of got carried away after they made the conference finals in, I believe it was 2021, and they realized that they pushed all their chips in, traded all these draft assets to get DeJounte Murray to try and be this backcourt partner with him. And instead, it sort of resulted in just a middling team, because that's ultimately who they were. And I do feel like they benefited a lot from a little bit of, I wouldn't quite say an easy schedule, because they did still have to beat the 76ers. And Joel Embiid was actually mostly healthy during that series as well. So, they earned their way there. But I think that they sort of overachieved in that season, and it convinced the front office that they were closer than they actually were. So they're taking a little bit of a step back and hoping to, build around Trae Young. And, Ingram could have potentially been a good fit and helped them immediately, but there's no guarantee that he can even stay healthy in this instance. And, just like everybody else, they are concerned about offering that much money to somebody that has an extensive history with injuries. He has missed 26% of the Pelicans' games since he was acquired in that Anthony Davis trade ahead of the 2019-20 season. And he's only played at least 65 games once in his entire career, which was his rookie season, where also happened to be the year that he played the least minutes per game, the only time that he hasn't played 30 per game. So, what I will say is that with this type of a situation with Atlanta, as if they felt like Kawhi, or if they felt like Brandon Ingram was not somebody that would be worth the investment, I can understand sort of, not going for this deal. If it was about being too concerned about the idea of him stepping on the development path of Zachary Reese-Shea, who they just took first overall, I am less on board with that. I think that considering the reputation that was surrounding the 2024 NBA draft, getting Brandon Ingram would have been a pretty good price for that number one pick. But again, if they just didn't have faith in Ingram and had no interest in paying him, I can't necessarily blame them either. But the part about being unwilling to move off of Clint Capella is interesting to me because, first off, I mean, I would have liked to see him in New Orleans. I feel like that would have been a pretty good fit. But he did just shoot a career worst 63.8% at the rim this past year. You know, he was over at least 71.5% throughout his entire stint of being a starter with the Houston Rockets for a number of years there. And it was a little bit of a significant decline, almost 10% worse from last season to this year. Now, they're clearly thinking that he can bounce back and that he is a good fit alongside with Trae Young. So, you know, again, if they're looking to build around Trae, Capella is probably somebody as a lob threat. Now, Larry Nance does also sort of fit that role, I think, as a pick-and-roll lob threat for Trae, but, you know, not a bad option to have multiple guys there that can play that style of basketball. And we don't know all the other details of what was in that package for if Capella was included in that, but I will say, you know, DeJounte Murray and Clint Capella for Brandon Ingram, and, you know, we'll, again, don't know exactly what else was in there, but if those are the main cornerstones, that is overpaying a little bit for Brandon Ingram, in my opinion. But it seems like Ingram isn't going to be moved this summer. Now, what does that mean for the Pelicans? On one hand, they get to hold on to a player that was legitimately in all-star conversations last year. Now, ultimately, he didn't make it. Games played were a part of that, but you know, he's still a very good player, and his market isn't necessarily sky high right now, but that doesn't mean that he's not talented by any means. I think that people are too low on him right now because of the fact that he was not the best version of himself in the playoffs, but it was partially because, you know, he had just missed practically the last 3 weeks with an injury, and that is, you know, part of the problem with him, of course, but he was dealing with that. I believe it was his left knee that kept him out the last 3 weeks up until game 82, where he played but was on a minutes restriction, and he just never really looked like he was himself, and he definitely got worked in that playoff series against the Oklahoma City Thunder. But I would like to think that they would be in a really good position, you know, moving forward here if it weren't for the fact that they only had one center. And again, that's why I would have liked the Capella fit in New Orleans, I think. But, you know, their only center is Yves Missi, who I do like. They took him in the first round of this past draft. He played at Baylor last season as a freshman, and I do believe in him, but just frankly, he's not going to be able to hold his own against a Jokic or Towns or Anthony Davis in a playoff series. So they're going to have to address that need. In a perfect world, they trade Brandon Ingram for a center in return, but it doesn't look possible at this very moment. I think that they play out this season with Brandon Ingram on the roster. Ingram could be a big-time, you know, trade target at the deadline. The Lakers, Cavaliers, Heat are all teams that feel like they are in the realm of competing, but I don't think are necessarily quite there yet. And Brandon Ingram could be a piece that a team talks themselves into. If he can stay healthy, I mean, he is legitimately an all-star caliber player. So I think that that is a very real possibility that he could be moved sometime, you know, in next winter or so. But before we move on to our next segment here, we do have to address some comments real quickly from Kelsey. She says, I want Kawhi to play in the Olympics, but with his past, I guess I understand him focusing on the season. I'm pretty much, you know, on the same board there. I think it would have been very cool to see him, you know, playing for Team USA, because we've never gotten to see him on that type of a stage before. So it would have been a very fun, and you talk about just putting together, you know, the Avengers of all of the biggest stars from the 2010s, and the fact that, you know, Kawhi is a very prominent piece of that generation, and it's something that we're going to be missing out on. But, you know, again, with his history of injuries, like you pointed to, I'm also sort of with it again. there are some things that are bigger than, an NBA regular season and I'm sure that winning the gold medal would be one of them to a lot of people, and I could understand that being the case, but again, maybe a little bit of a silver lining is the fact that he's going to have the opportunity to be healthier next year. So that's kind of where we stand with that. But we are going to be moving on to our next segment here. I did just mention that I think the Miami Heat could be a potential suitor for Brandon Ingram at the trade deadline. Now, as things currently stand, they are already over the luxury tax, but there are some things that could shake out next season that could potentially open up an avenue for them to cut some money and end up being rewarded with a player of Brandon Ingram's status. So I want to dive into all of that, but first we're going to be taking a quick break here. Don't go anywhere. We will be right back.